Why did the age of the Vikings actually end? Inequality, assimilation, and Christianity. Picture it. Dragon-carved longboats sliding out of the fog, savage fighters pouring onto the beach, entire cities stripped bare before sunrise. For 300 years, no coastline in Europe or beyond was safe from raids like this. Then, almost as suddenly as they appeared, the Vikings were gone, vanished, swallowed by history. That's the story most people tell. It's also wrong. The Vikings didn't vanish. They were absorbed, converted, and priced out of their own way of life. And the clues have been sitting in the historical record the whole time. Let's find out what actually happened. It starts on a beach in Northumbria. In the summer of 793, a messenger runs toward 3 unfamiliar ships pulled up on the shore. He doesn't come back. Within hours, the monastery at Lindisfarne is burning, its monks dead or dragged into the surf. And a phrase enters the English language that will outlive the men who coined it: the fury of the Northmen. Let's get one thing straight before we go further. Not everyone in Scandinavia was a Viking. The word itself probably comes from the Old Norse Vikinger, something like raider or pirate, though it didn't fully enter common use until centuries after the raids themselves. Most people living in what's now Sweden, Denmark, and Norway were farmers, weavers, and blacksmiths who never boarded a longship. Viking describes an activity, not a nationality, the specific act of leaving home to raid, trade, or settle abroad, roughly between 790 and 1066 CE. That activity became possible because of a piece of technology, a long, shallow-hulled ship in the style of the Nydam boat capable of crossing open ocean and sliding up shallow rivers alike. Give a farming culture a ship like that, and raiding becomes not just possible, but profitable. The written record of that Lindisfarne raid comes from a man who wasn't even there. Alcuin of York, a scholar writing from the safety of the continent, described the Lindisfarne attack as an assault unlike anything Britain had seen before. And his letters, along with the Domesday stone carved by survivors, are some of the earliest Viking accounts that exist. Worth remembering, almost everything written about the Vikings in this era comes from the people they were attacking. That bias never fully goes away. Part of why Lindisfarne registered as such a shock is what it violated. Among Christian kingdoms at the time, church land carried an unspoken immunity. Armies fought each other plenty, but plundering a monastery was widely treated as an offense against God himself, one severe enough to threaten a raider's soul in the next life. The Vikings, worshipping an entirely different set of gods, had no stake in that taboo. A monastery wasn't sacred ground to them. It was an undefended building full of silver. That single difference in worldview is what made the earliest raids feel less like warfare and more like an apocalypse. For decades, the pattern holds: hit hard, take what you can carry, take who you can sell, go home. Ireland gets hit particularly hard. The 836 raid on Clonmore marks the first deep inland expedition aimed specifically at capturing people for the slave trade. And by 841, the Vikings have founded a permanent base at Dublin. Then, in 845, a chieftain named Ragnar Lothbrok sails 120 ships up the Seine toward Paris. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, throws together a defense. Half of it is dead within the hour, and the rest retreat. Paris falls by Easter. Charles pays roughly 2,570 kilograms of gold and silver just to get the Vikings to leave, the largest ransom Europe has seen, and not the last. Charlemagne tries a different approach before this: forced conversion, backed by military campaigns against Norse sacred sites. It fails almost completely. Conversion by the sword produces more raids, not more Christians. But it plants something. For the first time, Christianity has a foothold, however small, inside Scandinavia itself. That seed matters more than anyone realizes yet. By 844, a year before the Paris ransom, Viking raiders push as far south as Seville, then under Arab control, before advancing into the Mediterranean. It's their most ambitious overreach. In 859, an Arab fleet catches a raiding party off guard and devastates it. The Vikings are pushed out of the Mediterranean for good, a preview of a pattern that repeats everywhere. Sooner or later, someone builds a wall, a fleet, or an army strong enough to make raiding not worth the risk. Constantinople delivers that lesson directly. In 860, roughly 200 Russ's Viking ships descend on the city. Patriarch Photius later describes their arrival as sudden as a thunderbolt. They burn the surrounding villages for nearly 2 months, but never breach the walls, and eventually withdraw. The message is clear, even if nobody's listening yet. Fortified cities are becoming a losing proposition for raiders. In 865, that lesson gets ignored on a massive scale. Ivar the Boneless and his brother Halfdan land in East Anglia with what chroniclers call the Great Heathen Army. Though it's worth flagging that historians still argue fiercely over how great it actually was, with modern estimates for its size varying by as much as a factor of 20 depending on the source. Whatever its true numbers, it's enough to take York in 866 and carve out territory across northern and eastern England. It's also enough to provoke a response strong enough to end it. By 871, Alfred the Great has pushed the survivors back into a territory called the Danelaw. And here's where the raiders start disappearing. Not into the fog, but into the population. Pushed into Danelaw, thousands of Norsemen stop raiding and start farming. They marry into local families. Their children grow up speaking a blended language, practicing a blended faith, belonging to neither culture cleanly. Multiply that across Ireland, across Normandy, across every coastal settlement the Vikings ever built, and you get an entire generation of people who are technically half Viking and functionally not Vikings at all. Normandy is the clearest example. The Frankish king Charles the Simple, unable to keep the Viking chieftain Rollo out of the Seine Valley by force, tries something else entirely. He gives Rollo the land outright. In exchange, Rollo agrees to defend it and to stop anyone else from raiding up the river. The land becomes Normandy, literally land of the Northmen. Within a few generations, Rollo's descendants aren't speaking Old Norse anymore. They're speaking French. And one of them is about to become King of England. Not every Viking settles down quietly, though. Around 985, Eric the Red leads an expedition to Greenland's west coast and talks 14 shiploads of settlers into following him there. A generation later, his son Leif Erikson pushes even further, landing on the coast of what's now Newfoundland around the year 1000 and naming it Vinland. That makes the Vikings the first Europeans to set foot in North America, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. But Vinland never becomes a second Normandy. The colony lasts roughly a decade before it's abandoned, likely worn down by conflict with the indigenous peoples already living there. It's a reminder that expansion and permanence aren't the same thing. For every settlement that takes root and blends into the landscape, another simply runs out of road. Back home, Scandinavia itself is changing shape. Around 950, major trading hubs like Birka start declining. Not because Scandinavians are struggling, but because power is consolidating. Kings are replacing chieftains, and a king who controls all the land has very little use for a system where any farmer can grab a sword, join a raid, and come home rich enough to challenge his authority. Land ownership starts shifting from personal to tributary. You don't just own your farm anymore, you owe the king for it. Leave to go raiding, and there's no guarantee your land is still yours when you return. That's not the only pressure. Alliances between kingdoms mean a raid on the wrong town can now start a war with the wrong king. Fortifications everywhere are getting stronger and more expensive to crack. The math that once made raiding profitable, high reward, manageable risk, stops working. There's also a simpler, more practical reason Christianity struggled to take hold early on. It didn't have much to offer a raiding culture. A religion built around loving one's neighbor and turning the other cheek has little use for people whose economy runs on plunder. For generations, Vikings treated churches as targets, not temples, valuable mainly for what could be melted down and carried home. But contact works both ways. The more Vikings traded with Christian merchants, negotiated with Christian kings, and settled in Christian territory, the more that religion stopped being a foreign curiosity and started being the default framework of the world they were now living in. Meanwhile, Christianity keeps advancing, but now it's coming from inside Scandinavia instead of outside it. When Sweyn Forkbeard conquers large parts of England and briefly becomes its king in 1013, he does so as a baptized Christian. Forkbeard's crown lasts only about 5 weeks before his death, but the symbolism outlives him. A Viking king now wins England not primarily through terror, but through statecraft, with baptism as part of the price of legitimacy. His son Canute inherits not just a throne, but a kingdom stitched together by treaties, trade, and religion rather than raids. The kings who once led warbands now spend their time managing alliances and collecting tribute, a very different job description than the one than their grandfathers had. By the time Harald Hardrada launches his invasion of England in 1066, with an estimated 10 to 15,000 men on as many as 300 ships, the Viking Age is already dying underneath him. He takes York on September 24th. Days later, King Harold Godwinson's army catches Hardrada's exhausted, overextended force by surprise at Stamford Bridge. One chronicler describes the river itself running red for miles with Viking dead. Both Hardrada and his ally Tostig are killed. Most historians mark this as the last gasp of the Viking Age. Not because raiding stops overnight, but because the world that made large-scale raiding possible has already disappeared. So what actually happened to the Vikings? Not one dramatic ending, 3 slow ones, running in parallel for over a century. Centralized kings replaced the free-roaming war band. Generations of intermarriage dissolved Viking identity into the cultures it touched, from Ireland to Normandy to the Danelaw. And Christianity, first rejected as a foreign imposition, eventually became the religion of the very kings who once led the raids. The Vikings didn't lose a war. They lost a way of life to something slower and quieter, their own children growing up as farmers, Christians, and subjects of a king, citizens of the very world their fathers once burned to the ground. So maybe the real question isn't where the Vikings went. Maybe it's this: how many generations does it take before a raider's grandson forgets he ever came from the sea?